Welcome to the fourth in the series of history lecture series, the Russian-American Encounter in Seattle. I can hardly wait. I am Eleanor Taves, the retired archivist of Seattle Public Schools and a friend of tonight's speaker, Elena Campbell. I'm going to do it like this. I first became acquainted with Elena Campbell shortly after she was hired by the University of Washington. As I recall, she was pulling her youngest child in a wagon at the Woodland Park Zoo. I believe that child might be here tonight. No? When I learned she was the new Russian historian at UW from Russia, my ears perked up because I'm ever mindful that I am the child of parents who were born in Imperial Russia and ended up as emigres in Manitoba, Canada. So here was someone I could talk to about my parents' childhood stories, where they lived, when they left, why they left. We could talk about our shared cuisine, the Russian candy at Christmas, which miraculously appeared at our doorstep one Christmas during the pandemic, thanks to Elena, and the many ways of making some of our family's favorite dishes, halapshi and borscht. It wasn't until last year, the fall of 2023, that she and I discovered we had another shared interest, this time a professional one. You see, about midway through my career as archivist for the Seattle School District, I had one of the greatest experiences in the 32 years I held that position. As with other schools being closed for demolition and renovation, as archivist, I was charged with providing an inventory of not only important public records, but also of significant historical material and records that required removal and protection during the construction process. Through a lot of searching, drama, and on-site inquiries, I was able to find a lost WPA mural that an artist had painted for West Seattle High School in 1937. The three-paneled mural had originally been installed in a wide entrance hallway at the school at eye level, and over the years had suffered from graphic embellishments by students, as you can imagine. After a few remodels of that entry and more graphic embellishments, the mural had been removed and stored out of view and forgotten. Doubtless, its value as an excellent example of WPA pictorial art had been forgotten or overlooked. The mural that I found consists of 3 panels depicting settlers landing in Seattle, bartering with Native Americans, and logging. As I said, with much drama, the mural was removed from its storage place behind a cupboard in the art room, appropriately enough, in May 2000, and subsequently turned over to an art conservator for damage treatment. The mural discovery made headlines, with much attention paid to its significance as a rare local example of WPA art. But oddly enough, or maybe not surprising, not much attention was paid to the artist, Jacob Elshon. Well, that all changed when I got a message from Professor Campbell last fall, asking if it was possible to see this mural. And that's a good question, actually. If it was in a school, schools have very tight security these days. So I pulled a few strings and made a few contacts and arranged for us to go and see it. One could say, and I really felt this that afternoon, the stars were aligned for me and Elena Campbell and resulted in part of tonight's presentation. To say much more of what followed would be to give away part of her presentation. So for those of you who are not familiar with Professor Campbell's work, let me highlight some of it for you. Professor Elena Campbell currently teaches undergraduate courses on the history of Imperial Russia from 1700 to 1917, the history of St. Petersburg/Leningrad from 1703 to the present, Russian history through biography, empire and nationalism in Tsarist Russia, Arctic histories, and history and memory. Professor Campbell also offers graduate seminars on the historiography and primary sources of Imperial Russia, and on empire and nationalism in Russian history. Her first book is The Muslim Question and Russian Imperial Governance. Her next book will take a new direction by linking histories of politics, economics, environment, science, and culture to explore the creation of the modern Russian North during the late imperial period. Currently, Professor Elena Campbell serves, now get this, as a co-representative of the University of Washington in U-Arctic. This is an international cooperative network, I hope I can say this right, based in the circumpolar Arctic region. Her talk tonight, Russian-American Encounters in Seattle, explores the multifaceted history of Seattle's engagement with peoples from the Romanov Empire and the Soviet Union, which included trade relations and commerce, Russian immigration, the Red Scare, Russian studies, and citizen diplomacy. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Elena Campbell.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, and thank you also for showing me Yeltsin's art, and I will share with you some of his art today in this talk, during this talk. So as the previous lectures in this series have reminded us, racial, ethnic, cultural diversity is a distinguishing factor of Seattle's history. Today, we will explore the Russian dimension of this history. However, instead of just focusing on the history of Russian immigration, I have decided to highlight different aspects of Russian-American encounters in Seattle, which involved various historical actors, such as performers, laborers, sailors, refugees, diplomats from the Russian Empire, as well as government officials and citizen diplomats from the Soviet Union. When and why did they come to Seattle? Why did some of them choose to stay? How did they view and shape Seattle? I will uncover visible and invisible traces of Russian presence in Seattle's physical landscape, as well as the city's cultural, academic, economic, and political life. And we'll highlight the role of the University of Washington in these encounters. I would also like to suggest that the Russian dimension is important for understanding Seattle's evolving, multiple, and at times contested identities. Finally, unlike the distant Ottoman Empire, the so-called old country of the Sephardic Jewish immigrants to Seattle discussed by Devin Nahr last week, Tsarist and Soviet Russia and the United States, as you can see, are and were Pacific neighbors. Although nobody would claim that Russia could be seen from one's home in Seattle, the geographic proximity or the geographic connection argument mattered in Seattle's relations, as we can see, for example, already in this excerpt, in this quote from Novaya Zarya, the Russian Dawn, a Russian language newspaper published in San Francisco, which in 1933 wrote, "Russian language has long been heard in Seattle, and immigrants from Russia, Jews, Poles, Latvians, and other Russian nationalities had favored the city as a commercial and industrial center, which was directly connected on the one hand to Alaska with its gold and other natural riches, and on the other with Primorye of Russia." Primorye of Russia, it's a coastal territory in the far eastern region of Russia. But the actual Russian, or rather Great Russian colony itself has begun to take shape only at the end of the 19th century. Another interesting aspect of this quote, now highlighted in red, is the author's description of different kinds of Russians, or people from Russia, and his use of two distinct words, Россия, which is related also to Российский, and Русский, both of which are translated into English as Russian. So before I take you on the historical exploration of Russian-American encounters in Seattle from the late 19th century to 1991, I have to make a few remarks about the meanings of Russianness and the imperial dimension of Russian history. So both the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union, often associated with Russia, were vast and tremendously culturally diverse polities, whose ruling elites aspired to achieve a great power status for their country. The modern Russian Federation is a product of imperial history, which included territorial expansion, state-driven modernization, revolutions, interactions between various cultures, as well as the competition of different nationalistic projects within the empire's borders and inter-imperial rivalry. By the end of the Tsarist period, the ruling Romanov family claimed political domination over a huge realm in northern Eurasia, as you can see on this map. Religion was an important marker of identity of Tsar subjects and an instrument of imperial rule. The Orthodox Church was officially the predominant confession, while non-Orthodox confessions were tolerated by the state. The official course of religious toleration didn't imply equality of different confessional communities or freedom of conscience. The Russian Empire was a corporate society with different laws for different social groups. Imperial patriotism was based on loyalty to the dynasty, to the ruling dynasty. Although Russian Orthodoxy was the dominant confession and the government tried to promote Russian as the state language during the late imperial period, the policy of Russification was not consistent. While Orthodox Russians were not the ruling nation and had to compete with the state for participation in politics. The imperial elite was ethnically and confessionally diverse. The ethnically Russian Orthodox population was socially and culturally divided into Europeanized elite and peasants, many of whom were serfs, not liberated until 1861, and thus not integrated into larger structure of imperial society. In the 19th century, nationalism presented a challenge to the officially Orthodox but multi-confessional, a state-based and autocratic empire of Romanovs, who were suspicious of any nationalism, Russian or non-Russian. While the Tsarist regime embarked on a program of modernization to be on par with other European powers, it was hesitant in introducing political liberties and allowing a wider society to participate in politics. The maintenance of vast empire justified the perpetuation of centralized autocratic government. During the late Tsarist period, class tensions became no less important than religious divisions or rising nationalisms. The Russian Empire and the Tsarist regime fell apart during World War I, and the February Revolution of 1917, which actually took place in March, but known as February Revolution because of Russia's use of Julian calendar until 1918. In November of the same year, leftist revolutionaries led by Bolshevik party leader Vladimir Lenin launched another revolution, often referred to as October Revolution, again because of the use of the Julian calendar, which plunged Russia into a civil war which lasted until 1923. So guided by internationalist and socialist ideas, Bolsheviks recreated most of the Russian Empire, as you can see on this map, in the form of the USSR, and even further expanded the country's borders within the geopolitical context of World War II. At the same time, faced with the national movements during the Revolution and Civil War, the Soviet government utilized nationalism to govern and modernize the multi-ethnic Soviet state. The Soviet state made nationality an important marker of citizens' identity and created a socialist, unitary, federative state composed of territory-based nationalities. And on this map, you can see the main units, with the Russian Federation as the largest unit, republic, Soviet Republic. So thus, the national identities of the people of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union developed in response to, and sometimes resistance to, the Tsarist and Soviet rule, as well as in connection to the multiple worlds of Eurasia. And for centuries, Russia was at the center of both empires, Tsarist and Soviet. But unlike Western European overseas empires, it had never formed a distinct metropole and became interconnected with the empire's peripheries. And this situation can be illustrated by the Russian language, which indicates that there are two kinds of Russianness. There are two distinct words, both of which are translated into English as Russian. Русский for people, language, and Российский for the empire, state, territory. The usage, however, was not consistent, as the quote from Novaya Zarya, which I read earlier, demonstrated, but there is an important difference in association between the two words. So this complex imperial legacy is important for understanding the nature of Russian-American encounters, the diversity of people who were often perceived outside of their homeland as Russians, as well as the interactions of these people with each other and with local communities in Seattle and their sentiments concerning their old and new countries. So before Russians and Americans claimed the North Pacific coast and waters, this region had been already populated by various indigenous people. Physical proximity between the two countries enabled connections across the ocean among the indigenous people and the newcomers who colonized the North Pacific coast of Eurasia and North America. At the same time, historically, for both Russians and Americans, this region was a frontier, geographically remote from the political and economic centers of their respective countries. Thus, depending on the changing political, ideological, economic context, the geographic proximity that enabled the so-called meeting of frontiers was viewed by Americans and Russians sometimes as potential opportunity or a problem. So Russians came to the northwest coast of America in the early 18th century as colonizers. The geographic proximity between North America and Eurasia was among several factors that enabled Russia's eastward expansion, driven by a desire for geographic discoveries, imperial ambition, and furs, a valuable commodity. Russians advanced eastward along the Aleutian Island chain and claimed the North Pacific coast territories in the Americas for the Tsars. The Russian-American Company, formed in 1799, governed Russian possessions, which included present-day Alaska and the outpost of Fort Ross in California. Known as Russian America, it was the only overseas colony of the vast Eurasian Empire ruled by the Romanov dynasty from the capital of St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea. The colony never drew many settlers from Russia, and in 1867, without discussing this issue with the indigenous people and residents of Alaska, the Tsarist government sold its Russian America to the United States. The Russian imperial legacy in Alaska included the Orthodox Church, which later played an important role in supporting the Russian diaspora, which later emerged in other parts of the United States, including Seattle, as we will see. Seattle was a village town at the time when Alaska was purchased, and it experienced its urban growth, urban revolution during the late 19th, early 20th century. In 1910, Seattle had a population of 237,194. The development of new means of transportation contributed to Seattle's growth, including the development of its connections with the outside world by steamships across the Pacific and via railroads with the US interior regions. New transportation links, together with the gold rush in Yukon and Alaska, boosted commerce in Seattle. The development of lumber industry was another important factor in the growth of Seattle and of the state of Washington. And these economic opportunities in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, together with the so-called push factors, such as Russian religious and political persecution, as well as the demands of military conscription in Tsarist Russia, contributed to the flow of labor migrants, deserters, religious and political dissenters from Russia to the Pacific Northwest. At the end of the 19th century, a local Orthodox priest reported up to 100 pure Russian people live in Seattle, including quite a few fugitives from Siberia engaged in menial work. There are also up to 150 Ossetians from the Caucasus, also laborers. There are up to 1,500 Russian Jews in Seattle. The latter are engaged in trade. They have homes and shops dealing in dry goods, recyclables, etc. on the main street. Many of them are well-off people who run grocery stores. They are also the leaders of the Russians, because the latter do not know English. So in 1905, and you can see the image here, the local Russian Jewish community was featured in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which wrote that some of the Jewish immigrants fled persecution in Tsarist Russia. About the same time, when Seattle was experiencing its urban growth, the Russian Tsars launched a rapid industrialization and expanded the empire's railroad network, which reached the far eastern port of Vladivostok. And you can see here the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So this was the main project during this time in late Imperial Russia. However, Americans leaped ahead of Russians in developing their Pacific coast and Seattle, thus inspiring Russians' hopes for economic potential, but also anxieties about the sovereignty of the Tsar's possessions on the Pacific. So the Trans-Siberian Railroad, launched in 1891, was not completed until 1904. Vladivostok, founded in 1860, was the only sizable and growing Russian city on the Pacific coast. While Russia claimed Eurasian North Pacific coast over 100 years ago, in some distant parts of this vast region, Russia's power was only nominal. Between 1896 and 1900, when prospectors rushed through Seattle to the Yukon and Alaska, some started looking even further west at their neighbor, across the Bering Strait, for possibilities of gold deposits on Russia's Chukotka Peninsula. So this part. And you can see from Nome, so it was very close. And reports like, for example, this one, and other reports about possibly finding gold in Alaska provoked fears among Russians that Americans would seize Chukotka, but also led to Russian-American cooperation, resulting, for example, in a 1900 expedition to find gold on the Chukotka Peninsula. This expedition was supported by the Russian government and included Russians, Americans, as well as Englishmen, Norwegians, Chinese, Poles, Mexicans, Finns, and Ossetians. For our purposes here, the expedition's route and logistics are especially interesting. To reach the Chukotka Peninsula, so we are looking here, this area. So to reach the Chukotka Peninsula, Russian participants actually went west. They went west from St. Petersburg to London, across the Atlantic Ocean, then across North America to San Francisco, and then to Chukotka. So as Ivan Akifiev, one of the Russian participants of the expedition, explained, it's more convenient to go from Russia to Russia through America. Yeah. Akifiev also wrote about local Chukchi when they finally reached Chukotka, who, according to him, spoke English, though poorly, and none spoke Russian. Americans evidently, he wrote, visit them frequently since they had whaleboats and Winchester rifles in sufficient quantity. And Akifiev cited one Chukchi, the village headman, saying, "We know there is the same Tsar for us Chukchi and for you Russians, but you don't visit us. And Americans bring us flour, guns, and tobacco. We know Americans better and understand their language, but Russians we absolutely don't know." So Akifiev was not the only one at that time who raised public and government attention in Russia to what he called Russia's forgotten territory. In the meantime, Americans continued trading with indigenous people on the Russian shores, some of whom also visited Seattle. So in 1908, Captain Amos Milton Baber from the North Star Trading Company, who had traded with Yupik villages along the coast of the Chukchi Peninsula for several years, brought 6 Yupik families from this area to Seattle to perform at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, which opened on the grounds of the University of Washington in June of the following year, so in 1909. Seasonal hunting expeditions and family trips across the Bering Strait were common among the Yupik, Siberian Yupik. However, their travel to Seattle and across the US was a different kind of experience. Before the exposition's opening, the group undertook a tour of Western and Midwestern fairs, where they posed for photographs, sang, danced, and demonstrate their skills, everyday activities, and traditions. The performance was advertised in the newspapers as the Big Arctic Show. In Seattle, the Siberian performers were joined by Inuit, Yupik, and Tlingit of Alaska and Labrador Inuit from Canada to perform in the so-called Eskimo village. So the 34 Siberian performers who came from the 3 different villages in the coastal and interior of Russia regions, northeast, were the largest group. The framing of the Arctic show, as you can see here, and of the Eskimo village was colonial. The newspapers often lumped the performers together in one category of Eskimo and portrayed them as children of nature and exotic curiosities. At the same time, as Josh Reed, Lisa Blee, other scholars have suggested, the indigenous performers were also participants in the fair and not simply the objects of the spectators' gaze. But why did indigenous people from Siberia travel to Seattle for the exposition? While the records are limited, Lisa Blee has suggested that traveling and performing in the US presented both dangers and opportunities, and that different indigenous performers attached different meanings and goals to their participation, viewing the experiences as potentially profitable endeavor, an opportunity to learn and for some educate the visitors or even influence public discourse. The Russian officials, however, didn't see this experience the same way. I don't know what the Canadian reaction was, especially given the frustration in Canada regarding its loss of the 1903 Alaska boundary dispute, but Russians issued a complaint that Baber had not secured official permission to remove the Siberian natives to the US and had kidnapped them. In response to this complaint, US immigration officials interviewed Baber and some members of the Siberian group. Baber claimed that he had known some members of the group for a long time, hoped to continue trading with the villagers. The 3 Yupik performers who were interviewed told about their business deal with Baber, and one of the performers said, "I came voluntarily to work, sing, and dance." So the history of American trade on the Chukotka Peninsula at the beginning of the 20th century is very interesting. I would only add that the so-called American traders included a very diverse group of people, some of whom came from other countries, including Norway, Australia, and the Russian Empire, to Alaska during the gold rush, and then engaged in trade relations with the native people of Chukotka Peninsula. And some of them married local women, thus establishing relationships which contributed to the success of their trade activities. What's important for us here is that the World Exposition of 1909, operated by Seattle's business and civic elites, as John Finley, has elevated the status of Seattle from a pioneer town to a city with imperial links to Alaska and regions beyond US borders. And the Siberian indigenous people, subjects of the Russian Tsar, even though they had their own motives, were included to reassert this vision. Seattle's growing economic role and ambition didn't remain unnoticed in St. Petersburg, and the Russian government's turn to the north during the late Tsarist period had also implications for Seattle. In 1906, a special intergovernmental mining commission at the Russian Ministry of Trade and Industry paid special attention to Nome and Seattle as the centers that spread American influence along the Russian coast of the Bering Strait. And in 1913, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs submitted a proposal to the State Duma, which was an elective legislative body created in 1906, to establish an imperial consulate in Nome and Seattle, which was justified by the growing Russian interest in this region. Russian officials planned the establishment of the consulate in connection with the government plans for the economic development of Russian Far East. Tsarist officials and Duma deputies claimed that because all commercial and industrial activity on the Seward Peninsula depended on Seattle, the closest US city to Alaska, creation of a new consulate would provide an opportunity for the Russian government to study measures taken by the United States to develop Alaska. They also envisioned that the consul residing in Seattle and visiting Nome during the summer months would monitor American activities in the Russian Far East, while also protecting the interest of the increasing numbers of Russian subjects who arrived in Seattle in search of job opportunities. Thus, in 1914, Nicholas II appointed Nikolai Bogayavlensky, who had previous diplomatic experience in the Russian Far East and China, as the first imperial consul of Seattle and Nome. The following year, Bogayavlensky's wife, as this newspaper announced here, arrived with her 3 children. As the local newspaper reported, the 2 sons would enter Broadway High School, while the daughter planned to enter University of Washington, when she had mastered enough English to carry her studies. So the beginning of Bogayavlensky's term coincided with the beginning of World War I. And in this conflict, the Russian Empire found itself in the same camp with Great Britain and France, while the US at first proclaimed its neutrality. The war opened an opportunity for the direct expansion of Russian-US trade and financial contacts. Russia needed American loans, military supplies, while US entrepreneurs saw the opportunity to take Germany's place on the Russian market. The Russian Procurement Committee was established in New York to make direct purchases of US railroad equipment, weapons, ammunition, medical products, and Seattle's port became an important hub for delivering the war supplies to Russia. In early October of 1914, Bogayavlensky announced that the Russian volunteer fleet would soon begin the operation of a line of steamers between the Puget Sound and Vladivostok, Siberia, and that American agents for the line had been appointed. World War I expanded the agenda of Russian-US relations by adding humanitarian issues, including American aid for refugees and prisoners of war, and providing impetus to develop Russian studies in the US and conversely, American studies in Russia. During 1915-16 academic year, Russian language instruction was offered at the University of Washington, and Nikolai Bogayavlensky, the consul of Nome and Seattle, saw this interest in Russian language as Russia's peaceful victory. That was important for developing Russia-US relations, since Seattle, and this is a quote, the gateway for the American trade with Eastern Siberia. The Russia-US rapprochement was given new meaning after the February Revolution of 1917, which led to the collapse of monarchy in Russia, and after the US joined the war in April of 1917. It seemed that renewed Russia and US found themselves on the same side of the military struggle for democracy. The February Revolution also encouraged many Russians, especially former political exiles and religious emigres who fled the oppression of the Tsarist regime early, to return to Russia from US, and many of them chose the Pacific route. The February Revolution didn't change the position of Bogayavlensky, who now represented the Russian provisional government and was busy assisting the increased circulation of people and goods between Russia and US through Seattle. However, while Russia was quickly moving toward another revolution, Seattle became the hub of turbulent labor movement. In 1917, the Central Labor Council and Industrial Workers of the World, or WOBLIS, had a strong influence among Seattle area workers. Labor groups opposed the US entrance into the First World War, and during the summer, WOBLIS organized strikes in the Pacific Northwest, while the government initiated a nationwide crackdown on the WOBLIS offices. As one historian put it, Seattle was a power keg. In the meantime, as a result of the 1917 October Revolution, Bolsheviks came to power in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, and embarked on the project of creating the world's first socialist state with a messianic mission for world revolution. Bolsheviks in Vladivostok proclaimed Soviet power on the Pacific coast. However, in Russia's Far East, which was remote from Russia's revolutionary centers, industrially underdeveloped and sparsely populated, Bolsheviks' position was rather precarious. The Russian port of Vladivostok almost was as close to Seattle as it was close to Petrograd. So more importantly, Seattle during that time was more accessible. Moreover, after the downfall of the Tsar, the increased flow of people between Seattle and Vladivostok also allowed the circulation of ideas and information. Thus, it's not surprising that the Russian-American trans-Pacific commercial contacts facilitated by Bagayevlensky, the Russian consul, and American business and Russian business elites, could also serve to create a common cause between Vladivostok Bolsheviks and Seattle radicals. So on December 21st of 1917, the Russian vessel Shilka, which was part of the Russian volunteer fleet, arrived from Vladivostok to Seattle with a cargo contracted by a local company for final delivery to Baltimore. The arrival of the first Soviet ship to the US shore sparked diverse reactions in the city. The conservative press and local establishments were anxious about the Bolshevik ship's supposed mission to aid the enemies of the United States, while labor press activists saw Shilka's arrival as an opportunity to learn about the Russian Revolution and advance their cause. Armed Navy cadets patrolled the pier, prevented unauthorized persons from getting on and off the ship, while anxious authorities were inspecting the ship. In the meantime, newspapers across the country made the Shilka's arrival a national sensation and drew Americans' attention to the port of Seattle, where, according to the reports, the Russian vessel brought propagandists, gold worth as much as $100,000, arms, ammunition to help the wobbly revolutionaries. The inspectors had not found the alleged 100,000 in gold, but discovered a cargo of licorice root beans and peas, as well as a small collection of rusty old Japanese rifles and Swedish pistols. This, however, sparked a new conspiracy theory that the proceeds of the cargo sale would be given to Wobblers to finance the defense of its members' standing trial in Chicago. Other stories connected the Shilka to a vast German-inspired worldwide revolt that included Bolsheviks, industrial workers of the world, anarchists, and even Irish nationalists. Even the mustache of the captain, which appeared to be German, caused reason for suspicion. Soon, though, some local newspapers, and I added some titles here on the slide, concluded that the Seattle Bolshevik mystery was a joke and that next time Seattle should not make a fool of herself. Yet other publications were still concerned that the ship's very ability to reach the American port meant that the country was not safe from the revolutionary poison spreading abroad, and Germany now had an open spy road across the Pacific. As historians have suggested, this episode was a prologue to the Red Scare in the United States. The local labor activists did manage to interact with Shilka's crewmen. For example, when one of them addressed the crowd at the Industrial Workers of the World Hall, Anna Louise Strong, an activist and reporter for the Seattle Daily Call, a weekly socialist newspaper, interviewed a Russian sailor. And on January 8th, when the Shilka sailed out of Elliott Bay carrying a cargo of pig iron to Japan, an enthusiastic crowd of well-wishers attended their send-off. When reaching Vladivostok in March, the Shilka delivered a letter from the Central Executive Committee of the Industrial Workers of the World of the Port of Seattle to Vladimir Lenin with the representatives of the Bolshevik government and through them the workers of Russia, which the local Soviet decided to publish. The letter expressed solidarity with Bolsheviks in their noble battle for liberation from the yoke of the capitalists and landlords, and recounted the details of Shilka incident in Seattle and of recent repressions. In January of 1918, Sukhanov, the chairman of the executive committee of the Vladivostok Council of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, in his article published in a local newspaper, emphasized the difference in attitudes toward the Shilka's crewmen and, by extension, to Soviet Russia. The American government on the one hand and American proletariat on the other. And in August of 1918, Pravda, the Moscow now-based official newspaper of the Russian Communist Party, published Lenin's letter to American workers, which was later delivered to the United States. In the Russian Far East, however, the Bolsheviks' position had become even more precarious. In the summer of 1918, Soviet power in Vladivostok was overthrown. In November, Admiral Kolchak's white, so anti-Bolshevik government took over Vladivostok, and the foreign armies, including American as well as Japanese and British, invaded the region. In Seattle, on February 6 of 1919, a general strike had been called in sympathy with the shipyard workers who sought to improve their lot, and a city of 315,000 people stopped working for several days. Most of the local and national press denounced the strike. There were also arrests. Federal agents also closed the Union Record, the labor-owned daily newspaper, arrested some members of its staff. Federal officials who managed the shipyards refused to negotiate, and as the workers went back to work, the newspapers across the country declared that Seattle had been saved. that the revolution had been defeated. The Russian consul, Bogayevlensky, who was in Seattle, he reported to the Russian ambassador, "This is not a strike, but a revolution. Bolshevism in Russia is developing Bolshevism in America is developing extremely quickly and will continue to develop. One can assume that unless something extraordinary happens, some kind of miracle, Bolsheviks in America will perform no worse than in Russia." So the solidarity between American and Soviet workers was particularly disturbing for American officials. In 1927, in her article published in the Soviet Union, Anna Louise Strong recalled how during World War I, Seattle was the center of revolutionary sympathies toward the USSR. In September of 1919, Seattle longshoremen refused to load arms destined for the Kolchak anti-Bolshevik forces in Russia. Eventually, the arms were loaded with the help of strikebreakers. Seattle acquired a reputation as a dangerous city, while Seattle workers had to travel to other cities to find work. Thus, Strong concluded that the labor movement in Seattle was weakened and reminded the Soviet readers of her article the sacrifices made by Seattle dock workers for the Russian Revolution. In late 1922, Bolsheviks reestablished Soviet power in the Far East. Kolchak was executed in 1920, and the retreating White Army fled to northern China, the region then known to Europeans as Manchuria. By the mid-1920s, this region became home to one of the largest Russian diaspora communities in the world, with 120,000 people living in Harbin. Russian was the language, even as you can see on this photograph. So was the language spoken on the streets and was seen on the signs and shops. The city drew people from different corners of the empire and walks of life. For many who came in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, civil war, and defeat of the White Army, Harbin served as a transit point to other countries. So the American coast, including Seattle, became one of the destinations for the so-called Harbin Russians, or Russian Harbinцы. Before their arrival, some American conservatives quickly saw Russian refugees as an opportunity for Seattle to rebrand its national image. In April of 1923, Frank Pease, an American anti-communist propagandist, contacted the city council of Seattle, urging them to extend help to the Russian refugees from the Far East. He wrote that these refugees were all conservative people with numerous women and children, persons of business, technical, and cultural accomplishments, and thus not likely to be, or but temporarily, a burden upon either the city or national community. He especially emphasized that by routing these refugees through Seattle and developing a plan for their welfare would present an excellent opportunity for Seattle to offset, what he said, the erroneous opinions existing elsewhere that Seattle is notoriously a red center, and notify the nation that Seattle is not one step behind any other city in its adherence to the principles of law, order, and conservatism. So the first group of Russian refugees from China were students who came in 1921 to Seattle to study. And here is an excerpt from the newspaper. It was much longer, but introducing some of those students. The next large group of refugees from the Far East, which included many educated Russians, former Tsarist officers, professionals, their families, arrived in July of 1923. By 1925, there were approximately 5,000 Russians in the city. Not all of them who arrived stayed in Seattle. Some moved to San Francisco, other cities in the US. The Depression of 1930s hit Seattle's economy and forced many to leave. According to Calvin Schmidt, and you saw these images earlier in John Finley's presentation, and I just wanted to remind you that in 1940, of the 63,470 Seattleites who were foreign-born, 2,371 were from Russia. As a result of the influx of refugees in the 1920s and 30s, and again after World War II, a Russian diaspora emerged in Seattle. The former Imperial consul, Bogayevlensky, and St. Spiridon Orthodox Church became the first points of contact for many Russian refugees who arrived in Seattle in the 1920s. The US government didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. Thus, Bogayevlensky continued to perform his duties. After the closing of the Russian consulate in San Francisco in 1924, Bogayevlensky remained the only diplomat representing old Russia and her now stateless emigre. So in 1933, he and other consuls in Seattle were invited to the University of Washington campus to mark the bicentennial birthday of George Washington by planting trees and creating what came to be known as the Consuls or International Grove on the UW campus between Sutsala Library and Smith Hall. So Bagaevlensky, this is Bagaevlensky, the Russian consul, but as you can see here, there is now, there's Latvian, Finnish, and Lithuanian. So representing now newly independent countries, former parts of the Russian Empire, but Bagaevlensky was still there, representing so-called old Russia before the Soviet Union was recognized. And Bagaevlensky indeed made Seattle his home. That's where he buried his wife in 1918. And the following year, he buried his daughter, remember, who was mentioned in the newspaper, who died from Spanish flu. And he died in Seattle too, and was buried here at the St. Nicholas Orthodox Cemetery in 1945. The St. Spiridon Orthodox Church was established in 1895 and originally drew many Greeks, Serbs, Syrians, Galicians, and some other Russians whose proportion grew at the beginning of the 20th century as a result of the increased labor migration and immigration from Tsarist Russia to Seattle. While Greeks in 1918 formed a separate congregation, the St. Spiridon Church served as the first refuge for the Russian arrivals from the Far East in the 1920s. The divisions and tensions that originated in Tsarist Russia played out in the emigre circles in Seattle and elsewhere in the US and Europe. The arrival of a large group of refugees in the 1920s brought them into conflict with some Russian old-timers, a tension which was sometimes described in political terms of the Civil War divisions, dividing the community in Seattle into the so-called whites and Bolsheviks. New Russian the so-called white emigres began forming societies and formal groups, organizing cultural events. In 1925, for example, the Society of Veterans of the Great War and the Union of Russian Invalids in North America were founded in Seattle. Former naval officers also formed their circle. Not all members of the societies were Russian Orthodox. They also included Lutherans and Catholics from the Russian Empire, thus reflecting the multi-confessional, multi-ethnic nature of the two important imperial institutions, the army and the navy. Yet the Orthodox religion, along with monarchist ideals, became an important organizing principle and the marker of the Russian colony in Seattle during these early years. In 1936, the Church of St. Nicholas was established in Seattle, designed in all Russian style, and it was dedicated to the memory of Russia's last Tsar, Nicholas II, and his family, murdered by Bolsheviks. The attempt to unite two parishes did materialize, and in 1938, the new building in Old Russian style was also built to house the St. Spiridon Church. Around the same time, another temple was built here, temple monument also to memory of Nicholas II and Imperial Russian soldiers who died during World War I. It was erected in traditional Russian style, modeled after a church in Sevastopol at the Military Brotherly Cemetery there. And it was located at the Russian Orthodox Brotherly Cemetery of St. Nicholas, established in 1928. And a former Tsarist officer and one of the most active members of the Russian colony, Alexander Yeltsin, was the founder of this project. In 1936, he wrote in Novaya Zarya that the construction of temples and monuments in memory of the legitimate monarch and his dynasty in Seattle and elsewhere in the world would eventually lead to the establishment of a legitimate regime in Russia and decent respect for us, the Russian people, throughout the world. Yeltsin hoped that one day the imperial all-Russian banner will unfurl over the Winter Palace on the glorious banks of the Neva. So this was 1936. Yeltsin died in 1951 and his prophecy didn't come true, even though after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian leadership adopted a curious combination of imperial and Soviet symbols to represent new Russia. In Seattle, the two Orthodox churches and the cemetery, which is a part of Vasheli Cemetery, which remind us of Yeltsin and other emigres who formed Seattle's Little Russia, are still visible today. After World War II, with the help of a new wave of immigrants, the Russian Community Center was established, and I will show you just 2 images representing some publications, again with religious symbolism, and of course the family of Nicholas II. And I will show you some other sites, visible and invisible, associated with the community of Russian emigres. Another site that for more than 35 years was a fixture of Russian community was the Moscow restaurant, which opened in 1923 and served borscht, beef stroganoff, холодец. I don't know how you would translate холодец. Gelid meat, gelid pig legs, Turkish coffee and pancakes. Russian refugee Prince Riza Kuli Mirza decorated the walls of the restaurant, while another Russian artist, Jacob or Yakov Yeltsin, so the son of Alexander Yeltsin, whom I mentioned earlier, designed the exterior. Eventually, the restaurant was lost to a highway constructed in the early 1960s. There was another Russian restaurant that was decorated, was painted murals. Apparently, there were several artists who lived here in Seattle of Russian origin. And another restaurant was called Russian Samovar on Capitol Hill. So the restaurant has changed its name. It's now, I think, it's called Cook Weaver, and no longer serves Russian food, but one can still see the murals designed by Russian artist emigres. So if you're interested, you can go to Capitol Hill and see the murals. Among the artists of Russian origin in Seattle, Jacob or Yakov Yeltsin perhaps became the most well-known. He opened a studio and produced hand-painted greeting cards, stage scenery, religious art, and actually when I showed you newspapers announcing the arrival of Russian emigres, there were a few sketches by Yeltsin in this newspaper. And in the late 1930s, Yeltsin painted murals, which were commissioned by the Depression-era Works Progress Administration and installed in public institutions such as schools, libraries, post offices in Seattle and larger area. And one of his murals was placed, as Eleanor told us earlier, in the main hallway of the West Seattle High School. But during the school remodeling in the 1950s and 70s, the murals were taken down, went missing, and the mystery of the missing murals was resolved in 2001 by Eleanor Tapes, who are the school system archivist. So the murals she uncovered were restored and returned to the West Seattle High School in 2002. And I'm very thankful to Eleanor for showing these murals for me. So after Yeltsin's death, his wife, in her interview, answered the question, why Yeltsin, I will talk about Yeltsin later. Why Yeltsin chose to stay in Seattle? And she said, although many singers and artists prefer to move to San Francisco or New York, Yeltsin loved Siberia. Seattle was like Siberia, the pioneering place. He liked the evergreen trees, water, and salmon fish, and he had a pioneering spirit. That's why he stayed. Of course, it was her interpretation. Another emigre, Ivan Novikov, who, like many others, first fled to China because of the 1917 Russian Revolution, came to Seattle, where he founded the Novikov School of Russian-American Ballet, and eventually opened more than 20 schools in Washington and Oregon. However, the Red Scare in Seattle didn't end with the departure of shilka. American society in the 1920s and 30s, and again after World War II, while also experienced this Red Scare, while also affecting some emigres of Russian origin in Seattle, and one of them was Natalie Brodskaya-Notkin. She was born in 1900 in Kherson, immigrated in 1921, and 7 years later with her husband, James Notkin, she became a naturalized citizen of the United States. She began working at the Seattle Public Library in 1925, and 2 years later, after graduating from the University of Washington's Library School, she became the head of the library's Foreign Books Division. In 1932, she was dismissed after being accused of selecting obscene and communist books in the Russian language and of being a communist. Notkin's case was not just a local matter. The impulse came from Washington, D.C., where a special committee of the House of Representatives, chaired by Representative Hamilton Fish Jr., was formed to investigate communist activities in the United States. The committee held hearings around the country, including Seattle, and it was that visit that prompted Seattle Police Chief Louis Forbes, who also provided testimony earlier, to pursue his investigation of communists in Seattle. So on November 4th of 1930, he submitted the results of his investigation in a letter to Congressman Fish. The letter accused Notkin and 17 other Seattle residents of being communists. Notkin, though, was the only public employee on this list. The letter was included in the published official report of hearing in 1931. This information reached Seattle. Notkin declared that she was not a communist. Nevertheless, the Seattle City Council cut her position and salary from the library budget. And on February 2nd of 1932, the library board agreed to dismiss her. Notkin had purchased Russian books as a part of library's collection. And in part, and actually for the most part, in response to the growing post-revolutionary Russian emigre community, thus creating one of the largest collections of foreign language books at the Seattle Public Library. A few years before her dismissal, Notkin, in her annual reports, noted that the Russian collection presented the greatest problem and mentioned the political struggles over the content of the Russian collection. In particular, she pointed out to the role of a vocal minority of Russian patrons who objected to any Russian language books coming from the Soviet Union and favored Russian language books written and published by anti-communist Russian refugees. So the controversy over Russian books was just one manifestation of the divisions and tensions within the Russian community. Notkin and the head of the library, Jennings, who earlier stated that the books should represent different points of views, refused to take sides in these controversial questions. Yet the library board, aware of these early complaints coming apparently from the members of the Russian community, while also looking for a solution to the budget cut issue, decided to sacrifice Notkin. And the Fishes Commission helped making this decision. So the legal efforts of Notkins and her attorneys failed. This sad chapter in the history of Seattle Public Library has been reconstructed by Seattle post-intelligence journalist John Douglas Marshall, who in 2004 published a history of the Seattle Public Library. Later, Natalie Notkin was hired by the University of Washington, where she was a Russian language instructor and a librarian. And her husband, James Notkin, also a Russian emigre, founded an engineering firm, James Notkin and Associates, which was involved in many, many local construction projects, including, by the way, the public library's Magnolia branch. So I guess Notkins didn't hold a grudge against the public library. Well, University of Washington played an important role in Seattle's engagement with Russia and Russians by making the Northwest region conscious of Russia's and the Soviet Union's role in international affairs, especially in the Pacific, and stimulating interest in Russian culture. Seattle's geographic proximity to Russia and Siberia was often one of the main arguments employed by the advocates for developing Russian studies at the University of Washington. And one of these promoters was Ivor Spector, another Russian emigre and an instructor in the so-called Oriental Studies, who played an important role in expanding the offerings in Russian literature, history, culture during the 1930s and 40s at the University of Washington. He was the author of many publications, some of which I listed here. He is credited with contribution to the creation of the Slavic department, the building of the University of Washington's prominence in the field of Russian and East European studies. But the figure of Spector, however, is interesting also for other reasons. His connections to multiple cultural worlds and the challenges he encountered when trying to take an objective approach to highly politicized and divisive matters. And here I would like to read for you an excerpt from the only novel that Spector published. The novel is titled Through the Fog and was published in Tacoma in 1930. One autumn day, a man stood on the third-class deck of a steamer bound for New York. He had heard fellow passengers who understood English say that the boat would dock within a few hours. He looked back over the restless waters that separated him from his native land, a land veiled in obscurity and mystery for the rest of the world, a land concerning which there was so great misunderstanding and misrepresentation, a land from which came such conflicting reports that the world knew not what to believe. In that far land, all of whom he had loved were dead. Nothing remained for him there. But America was before him, the land of promise, the land of hope, the land wherein the oppressed might find justice. In this excerpt, Spector described the final destination of the novel's main character, Joseph Morozov. The novel begins in 1908 and tells a story of a 13-year-old boy, Joseph, whose mother was a descendant of Sephardic Jews and whose father belonged to the Greek Orthodox Church. Spector follows his character's life through the turbulent times of World War I, Revolution, Civil War, and that brought devastation to his Jewish and Christian family and friends. The question of religious tolerance is one of the main themes that preoccupied Spector in his book, which he dedicated to the Russian intelligentsia, regardless of nationality and race, rank and station, who died in the revolution. Like Joseph, Spector was born in the region of the Russian Empire, which is now a part of modern Ukraine. He acquired Russian education and the knowledge of Hebrew, and was an aspiring writer. In 1920, he immigrated to the United States via New York, where the immigration authorities registered his name as Itzhak Spector. Under this name, Spector applied for citizenship, attended first Northwestern University, then University of Chicago, where he wrote a dissertation about Jewish ethics in 1928, later published with the aid of the Jewish community of Tacoma. It was also in Tacoma where Spector taught Hebrew, and this is an advertisement of his courses, which included not only the language, but also history and politics. And he's mentioned here as the director of Board of Hebrew Education. And all of this happened before he assumed the position of a Russian language instructor at the University of Washington in 1931. Probably around the same time, he changed his first Jewish name, Itzhak, to Scandinavian Ivar. In Seattle, he also joined the University Gathering United Methodist Church in U District. Well, further research is needed to understand the details of Spector's background and the circumstances of this transformation. Perhaps the new world in Seattle was not a perfect place, as his novel's main character imagined, and especially in light of the activities of fascist groups in the Northwest during the 1920s and 30s. Like Joseph, Spector strove to explain what he said to the true affairs in Russia to the outside world. As he wrote, either we'll get along with Russia or we won't, but either way we must be able to understand her. But how to promote an unbiased view of Soviet Russia without being labeled as a Bolshevik, and thus the enemy in the country torn by fear of communism? Unlike Natalie Lotkin earlier, Spector received support from his colleagues. For example, in 1944, Leopold Zieg, UW president, in his response to a letter written by a concerned citizen who accused Spector of carrying on a propaganda campaign in his articles about Soviet policy published in the Tacoma News Tribune, wrote, "Dr. Spector is a loyal American citizen and a serious-minded educator. As a scholar, he doesn't cater to anyone, but seeks to analyze and diagnose conditions relative to his own field, Russian studies, to the best of his ability." Well, World War II stimulated an increased interest in the Russian field. For example, UW offered during this time radio course in Russian language. Some high schools were offering Russian in their evening programs. And the Soviet-American alliance was critical for the defeat of Nazi Germany, and the Pacific Northwest again played an important role in the Allied operations of transporting Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. In 1944, Spector's colleagues published a collection of articles titled Soviet Far East and Pacific Northwest, published by the University of Washington Press. And they argued that the war led to the emergence of Soviet Russia as a great power and provided a common ground upon which Americans and Soviets could build on. Again, the geographic proximity argument played an important role. The authors hoped for a new post-war period of Soviet-American cooperation on the basis of equality, not American leadership, especially in the development of communication lines. And you can see it's not a very good image, but all the lines that were also projected on land, air, and on water, projects in which they emphasize the Pacific Northwest and Seattle would play a special role. But shortly after the end of the war, the former allies became rivals and started to see each other as a threat. So labor migration emigration, commercial relations, diplomacy, development of Russian studies, wartime allied operation, as well as fraternizing efforts and suspicions during the Red Scare era, which I have discussed so far, certainly do not embrace the richness of Russian-American encounters in Seattle. And in conclusion, I just want to touch on another important facet, which involves citizen diplomacy and many people-to-people connections with the Soviet Union during the Cold War period. And again, the Pacific Northwest and Seattle played an important role in these relations, and in some cases, struck first. So I just want to remind you about a few important episodes in this history. At the time, the vision of Seattle as the gateway to the Soviet Union and the emphasis on Seattle's special ties with Russia were mobilized by city business and civic elites during the so-called Détente period of 1972-79, and again during Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, so restructuring and openness of the late 1980s. And Seattle's and Pacific Northwest people-to-people connections that developed during this time involved sister city connections. The first sister city relationship between American and Soviet city was established between Seattle and Tashkent, the capital city of the Soviet Republic of Uzbekistan, in 1973. And in 1987, Seattle hosted the US-Soviet Sister City Conference. In 1985, perhaps some of you remember, the so-called space bridges, which linked via satellite the live audiences in Seattle and Leningrad, the so-called Citizen Summit, was organized with Phil Donahue and Vladimir Pozner as hosts. And many other scientific collaborations, cultural educational exchanges, joint business ventures, Alaska Airline flights, parish-to-parish connections, and so on, culminating in the largest US-Soviet exchange, the Goodwill Games, which took place in Seattle in summer of 1990, when Russians, or better to say Soviets, were really coming. But not all Seattleites supported what they saw as the unconditional rapprochement between the two superpowers and felt that the Soviets had to be confronted, not appeased. For example, the Seattle Action for Soviet Jewry, which was formed in 1974 to stop the discrimination of Jews in the USSR and help the so-called refusniki, Soviet Jews who were not permitted by the Soviet state to immigrate to Israel from the USSR, raised the Soviet Jewish issue at various citizen diplomacy events hosted in Seattle and tried to influence national foreign policy. For some Seattle's activists, the Jewish issue, as well as the issues of religious freedom and human rights more broadly, were closely related to the future of US-Soviet relations. The so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the 1974 Trade Act, which affected US trade relations with countries restricting Jewish immigration and violating human rights, including the Soviet Union, was co-sponsored by Henry Jackson, US Senator from the state of Washington. At the same time, some of the formal citizen diplomacy ties, such as the Seattle-Tashkent connection, were utilized by local activists to reach out to the Soviet citizens concerning the matters of nuclear arms control and visit Soviet refusniki in the USSR. So this period of intensified direct personal connections and tensions they produced present a remarkable period in the history of Russian-American relations in Seattle and Pacific Northwest, which deserves a book-length study. And my colleague Eric Johnson, who will come here in a few minutes to manage the questions and answers portion, and we have started collecting materials related to this very rich chapter of Russian-American encounters, and I just want to invite you, if you have any materials related to this or other chapters of Russian-American encounters in Seattle, please, and would like to donate these materials to the UW Library Special Collection, please let me and Eric later know. But again, a notion of special ties between Russia and especially Russia's Far East, or as some termed it, Americans' Near East, and the Pacific Northwest motivated and justified US-Soviet encounters in Seattle, which increased after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the following year, the Russian consulate was opened in Seattle. 2 years later, in 1994, President Boris Yeltsin of Russia visited Seattle at the end of his American tour, which also included New York and Washington, D.C. So the development of trade relations between the United States and Russia and American investment into Russian economy were of particular concern, and these are some headlines from different newspapers describing the upcoming or already describing the happening visit of Yeltsin to Seattle. So in his pitch for investment, Yeltsin said, "The Pacific Northwest and Russian East Asia have a special link." Covering his visit, the New York Times article noted, "Mr. Yeltsin's visit recalled the historic links between Russia and the Northwest via the Pacific Ocean, links that are starting to pay off in trade. Seattle is a mainland American city closest to Russian territory, excluding those in Alaska." But was the geographic proximity enough for developing US-Russian cooperation across the Pacific? Yeltsin probably understood the importance of other factors and said to the West Coast business leaders in 1994, "Yes, you were afraid of political instability, but today, let me assure you, we have achieved political stability." Well, unfortunately, his promise proved to be too optimistic. Thank you.